Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, it's indeed my proud privilege to welcome each one of you to another edition of our evening talk, Budget 21 analysis under the magnifying glass. In fact, in MMA, indeed blessed to have three outstanding speakers, outstanding analysts who think differently than what normally thinks. We have Dr. Mohan Guruswamy and Dr. Arun Kumar. I'll be introducing them short while for now details, and Air Marshal Matheshwaran will be leading the conversation. I think today's talk, Budget 2021 analysis, as I mentioned to you, we have three outstanding speakers. Budget gave a lot of excitement to the people. We got of accolades, a lot of anecdotes, and everybody said bold and very good budget and abandoned the traditional cost of fiscal deficit. And you also going to hear from our distinguished, really outstanding speakers. Ashwatthama is dead, or maybe a man, maybe an elephant, Mahabharata. So many things are going to be there. Air Marshal Matheshwaran will set the context and take you through. And let me have the privilege of introducing the distinguished panelists for this evening. And before that, let me once again warmly welcome all the viewers who are watching this program live on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and live on our webcast, and also live on our MMA radio. And also have a very special welcome to all the invitees from Peninsula Foundation who have joined us this evening. It's indeed a pleasure to have you with us. It's always a pleasure to work with Air Marshal Matheshwaran and bring in some outstanding management talks to you. Let me have the pleasure of introducing the distinguished panelists for this evening. Mr. Mohan Guruswamy. Mr. Mohan is UG in Mathematics and Physics and Chemistry, and he is an alumnus of John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. He is also the head of the Center for Policy Alternatives in New Delhi, and he is a frequent commentator in national and international televisions and radios. His papers, the Redefining the Poverty, Income Inequality, Backward, Bigard Economic Development in West Bengal, FDI, all been very well published, and his detailed profile has already been shared with you along with the invitation card. And let me have the privilege of introducing Dr. Arun Kumar. Dr. Arun Kumar is not new to MMA. We had a privilege of interacting with him on a couple of occasions. Arun joined JNU in '84, and he is also has a PhD in economics from JNU and Master of Physics in Princeton University, USA. He's a gold medalist in Delhi in Higher Secondary School Board and Delhi University. The book published by him, The Black Economy, Higher Education, Indian Economy Since Independence and Demonetization, etc. He has visited a number of international organizations, including International University Italy and University of Germany and much more. He was a member of the first pay commission of Tibetan government in exile. And Arun is the most sought after speaker because he takes things. He's very candid about his views, and his views are a little out of the box. And we are going to have a wonderful insight from Mr. Arun Kumar. Once again, very welcome to you, sir. It's indeed a pleasure to have you. Let me have the privilege of introducing Air Marshal Matheshwaran, my veteran, my colleague from the Indian Air Force. Air Marshal is now the chairman and president of the Peninsula Foundation, Chennai. He is a former deputy chief integral defense staff at headquarters IDS, the Tri-Service Command. Then he is also the senior air staff officer of Eastern Air Command, which is the one which really takes care of some of the very important sectors in Eastern sector, which also deal with China and much more. Air Marshal has had an active service for over 39 years. He is a graduate of IAF Elite Fighter Weapon Establishment, TACD, and is also a member of Test Pilot School, one of the finest known test pilots in Indian Air Force. He is a founder member of the Nuclear Command, and he is also a senior fellow and alumnus of Howard Kennedy School of National International Security Programs. He is a strategic advisor to defense and aerospace businesses. Very warm welcome to Air Marshal Matheshwaran. Air Marshal, now I'll request you to take over and brief on the content and format of the session, and over to you, Air Marshal.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you. Today is a very important discussions, and I welcome everybody on behalf of the Peninsula Foundation and the MMA. We have, particularly considering the topic, I think we can't hope for having a better panelists than Professor Arun Kumar and Sri Mohan Guruswamy. Both are known for their very candid views and exceptionally professional, analysis of issues. And that's what we are hoping to have this evening. The budget has come at a time when the whole world has been disrupted by the pandemic, and we know what the economy has gone through. And of course, Professor Arun Kumar's interview with Karan Thapa has really gone viral, where the contraction figures of that he's actually put it out in his book, have really raised a significant concern as well as significant discussions. The budget has claimed, as you've seen in the headlines, it's claimed to be a big push for growth, a lot of focus on infrastructure. It claims that the economy was impacted by the pandemic, and the resulting contraction is estimated at 7.7%. And the budget estimates, look forward to a rebounding growth at 11%. All this are, I think, topic for big discussion. We really need to raise few questions. There are also significant announcements that have been made, which look like, in the context of upcoming elections in Tamil Nadu, Bengal, and Assam, and they look like more political statements than very well thought out real plans. So what we need to look at is, does the budget become a political exercise every year, or is there a very well thought out continuity in the budget process for a long-term development and growth? And there are, of course, crises that will hit us, like the 2008 crisis across the world, or the pandemic that has now, affected all of us. These have to be overcome with well thought out strategies and good grasp of realities. One of the important observations that, and then the question that I posed to Professor Arun Kumar is that, are we, as a common person who's looking at various discussions, tends to raise the doubt, are the data that being, put across, is there a data integrity? Is there a problem in the analysis, in the way data is used to actually project various interpretations and various, projections? And this is something I think we need to discuss significantly. And of course, coming to one of the important observations which is of interest to us is, given the kind of climate that exists in the borders and the problems that we've had with China, we've had a big sloganeering on Atmanirbhar, and of course, it's an important requirement to create self-reliance in defense capabilities and industries. But it all needs investment and a good, well thought out strategy. So these emergency purchases have already been factored for. And now when people say that there's been the highest increase in CapEx allocation for defense, I think there are questions that need to be asked in that. I don't see actually a big increase in that CapEx. So what we will do is we will first get overview from the two panelists, starting off with Professor Arun Kumar and then Sri Mohan Gurusamy, 15 to 20 minutes each. And thereafter, we will initiate the interactive process. Professor Arun Kumar, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Air Marshal, for inviting me. Thanks to MMA and your organization for organizing this. I'll share the screen and I'll make my PPT presentation. So I've titled it as Union Budget 2021-22, a macroeconomic analysis. And it's based on, my new book, which has come out recently, in December, called Indian Economy's Greatest Crisis. I'm going to present this based on the theoretical framework in my Economic and Political Weekly article, which came out on September 26, 2020. And now the book released in December end. And what I've argued is that this is the greatest crisis of the Indian economy and society because of the collapse of economy, which was unprecedented. And it has social and political ramifications as well. And these will be long lasting. And the other thing that we must understand is that we are headed towards a new normal. Even after we have overcome the crisis that we are not likely to go back to where we were in 2019. And therefore, we need to plan for it from now. Otherwise, we'll be having problem later on. Now, as an introduction, there are a lot of things in our budget, all kinds of things there are, because, it's spending about 35 lakh crores of rupees, which would be about 17% of the GDP. So there are a lot of things. But the basic thing is that we need to be clear about the macro aspect. The macro aspect, if that is not right, then the other things will also not work right. And the finance minister had already said that this is going to be a once in a century budget. But is that really true? And what I will try and present is that it's far short of what was required to be done. If we are to restore the economy back to the pre-pandemic levels, then a lot more needed to be done. Now, a budget is divided in the part A of the speech and part B of the speech. And part A of the speech spells out all the nice sounding things. It says how much we have given to this sector or that sector, and the poor people, etc., etc. But the question is, how far will those be achieved? That always is a question that we have to answer. And the framework of this budget has been given as the Atmanirbhar Bharat scheme, which is a supply side framework. It's not a demand framework, but it's a supply side framework. So how far will that help in restoring the economy? That's a question. Now, there'll be a boost to the growth, okay, but the point is that it's less by 10%. The government says that the recovery is taking place, and now in Q3 and Q4, we'll have almost back to 2019 level. But if you really look at it, clearly a lot of services are not restored, whether it be hotels and restaurants and travel and tourism and trade, etc. And at least 20% of the unorganized sector workers who had lost employment have not been able to find work. So therefore, there is a lot of decline in the GDP still, and it's, I think, less by 10%. It's not as if it has got restored to the last year, 2019's level in January as yet. So it was expected that in the budget, given the health crisis, there'll be a major component for the health sector. And the expenditures would be stepped up on the health sectors. But if you look at the health sector alone, then it has come down from 82,445 crore in the revised estimate of current year to 74,602 crores for the coming year. So instead of increasing it so that we can step up our health infrastructure, primary centers, secondary centers, and tertiary centers, and also do a lot of R&D, because these pandemic, the virus is mutating all the time. So instead of doing that, we are now reducing it as compared to the current year. We are, of course, saying that we have increased it by 137% by including water and various other sanitation schemes, etc. So it's good to give more money to water because, clean drinking water is necessary, but still the health component also needed to have been increased. Similarly, it was expected that the allocation to agriculture would be increased, to rural sector would be increased, because the farmers are protesting that their incomes have gone down. So it was expected that there'll be a big component of the budget going to agriculture and rural areas. Similarly, as the Air Marshal mentioned, defense also was a critical area because of the crisis that we are facing on both our borders with the two neighboring countries. But that's also not in evidence, as the Air Marshal has already pointed out. Now, this gives you some idea of what's happening to the allocations in the budget. Compared to the revised estimates, you can see that the defense is hardly changing at all. Of course, compared to the budget estimate of 2021, it has increased. But what you have already spent on that is where you have to continue to spend more, and that is not increasing very much. Similarly, in agriculture and allied activities, you can see that there's hardly any increase in the revised estimate, and as compared to the budget estimate, it has come down. Then in the case of education, the allocation is hardly increased compared to the budget estimate. It is a revised estimate shows a much lower expenditure than what was done last year or the year before. Health, as I said already, that we have come down, and then rural development has come down drastically from 2,16,000 crores to 1,94,000 crores. So in other words, some of these things that were expected to go up are not really going up much or going very little. Now, what is the problem? As I said in part A, we present the macro picture, and for the first time in the budget, the macro picture was not presented because it's obviously quite adverse. So usually the budget speech begins with giving data on the growth, on inflation, on balance of payment, etc. But that was not done. Similarly, at the end of the speech, we are always told what are the additional revenues or loss of revenue because of the various tax proposals and the various tax changes that have been done. And that also was not announced in the budget speech. Of course, these things are there in the detail, in the annexures and so on, but usually it's part of the speech. Now, why has been the crisis there in the economy at the moment? And that is because of a lot of unemployment, and many businesses are facing closures, and farmers and the unorganized sector are in distress. And that's why there's a demand shortage in the economy. Because of the demand shortage and some of the services which are contact services which can't work, that's why you're having a problem. So to overcome the demand problem, you needed to step up expenditures very sharply. And if you look at the overall expenditure budgeted is 34.8 lakh crore, but the current year's expenditure is 34.5 lakh crore. So in other words, there's hardly much of an increase in the overall expenditure. Now the private demand has declined because, as the RBI's survey showed, consumers and business people have lost confidence in the economy. So the private sector has declined, and that had to be compensated by the increase in public expenditure. But the overall public expenditure is hardly increasing by 0.3 lakh crores, which is less than even 1% of the figure that was spent this year. So in other words, the overall budget is not leading to an increase in demand, and that's something very significant. Now, the fiscal deficit has been estimated to be 9.5%. But overall, if you really count it properly, and because the revenues are likely to be lower, if you add the states to it, add the public sector to it, then the overall fiscal deficit is likely to be around 20% rather than 9.5%. 9.5% is only what the center is stating, and that too, assuming that it's going to spend the money and that it's going to get the revenue that it is planned for. But I think the revenue will be short, and that's why the center's fiscal deficit will also be higher than 9.5%. And therefore, the overall fiscal deficit is likely to be 20% rather than 9.5%. For the next year, the fiscal deficit is planned to be 6.8%. But again, because revenue projections are higher, therefore, I think it is likely to be higher than that. And one important thing that's been done in calculating 9.5% is that there's a transfer from the budget to the Food Corporation of India for the past loans. So that's about 3 lakh crore. Now that 3 lakh crore, which has to be subtracted from the fiscal deficit, because that is only a transfer. So that will not lead to an increase in demand. So in other words, the government, needed to step up the fiscal deficit more if it wanted to increase the demand substantially more. Now, there are two problems regarding the deficit, that we have the same expenditure at a smaller deficit in the coming year. So the question is, if the expenditure doesn't rise and if the fiscal deficit is slated to be lower, then the demand will not rise that much. And that will create the following problems. First, the deficit will turn out to be higher, as I said, because the revenues will be short. And therefore, in 2021, when the economy is officially supposed to have shrunk by 7.7%, but the unorganized sector is not contained in this data. And therefore, the economy would have shrunk by far more than 7.7%. And that's why your revenues will be lower. So when the fiscal deficit shoots up, what happens? The government starts cutting back capital expenditure and social sector expenditures. That's the usual response of the government. So I am worried that in the coming year, as it is, the social sectors are not getting very much, they will be cut back. And the capital expenditure, which is supposed to go up, that will also be cut back. So that's the first set of problem if our data is incorrect. Second, and very disturbingly, the key items that could boost demand quickly have been curtailed for 21-22, like the allocations to the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, National Social Assistance Program, PM Awas Program, PM Kisan, and food subsidy. They've all been curtailed. Now, these are the items which go into the hands of the poor people, and they would raise demand if they get more income and more money in their hand. But that is being curtailed because there are other expenditures that have been raised. So what is the budget trying to do? It's trying to boost the business sentiment. The signaling is that, okay, we have not put any additional tax, no additional cess. So people are expecting that there may be a wealth tax, there may be some other taxes, there may be some cess, etc. But since none of them have come, I think the signal to the business is that you can go about business as usual. Then the signal to business also is that we are going to disinvest and monetize the public sector assets. This is again a signal that is positively read by the businesses. And then the sale of public sector assets, disinvestment of LIC are also signals to the business to improve their sentiment. Now, the question is, when we look at the public sector, the government says we'll do minimum government and maximum governance. And that's why the public sector is being dismantled. banks are being nationalized, LIC is being, partly sold out to others, etc. But what is the lesson from the pandemic? The lesson from the pandemic is that a well-functioning public sector is very essential if we are to take care of any crisis, whether it be in transportation like railways and air, or whether it be in terms of hospitals, etc. So we need an efficient public sector, but the public sector is being demolished so that in the next pandemic or the next crisis, the government will not be able to have the instrument to be able to support the economy more. And let us remember that a capitalist economy is characterized by market failure. And as the economy gets more and more complex, there are more and more areas of market failure. And where the market fails, then the government has to step in. So whether it be in the case of public goods, in the case of defense, whether it be in the case of social sectors like education and health, a good and well-functioning public sector is very essential. For instance, currently you can see that large number of poor people are withdrawing their children from private schools because they have lost income and putting them in public sector schools. So we needed to step up the expenditure on public education so that the children could continue to get good education. But instead of that, what we are doing is we are dismantling the public sector to try and raise resources. And I'll come to the question of resources a little later. Now, what is required to make the whole system better is to end cronyism. The problem with our public sector has been that there's been a lot of cronyism where those in power have utilized the public sector for their own ends. So we need to bring in accountability. Without accountability, the public sector will not be efficient. So accountability has to be introduced. That is the key. So what we require is not less rules, but implementation of rules. India is characterized by not that many rules as say in an advanced country, but every rule that exists is broken. Every rule is manipulated. So if cronyism continues, then having less rules is also not going to work. So our politics has to be cleaned up, and without cleaning up the politics, I don't think it will work whether we, nationalize or we privatize the public sector. So I think that the root problem is somewhere else, but we are taking it out on the public sector. Now, let's look at the investment and disinvestment. Public investment, expenditure on capital items will be stepped up from 4.39 lakh crore to 5.54 lakh crore. But we are also stepping up disinvestment. So disinvestment means we are giving up capital items. That means we are selling off the capital item. So it's the net amount that's the increase in the investment. And the private sector, which will buy the assets, they would have invested the money somewhere else, but instead they are going to invest it here. So disinvestment by itself does not lead to an increase in the investment if you take the public sector and the private sector together. And it also means that the public investment is less by that much amount. So if you subtract 1.75 lakh crore from the 5.54 lakh crore and from the 4.39 lakh crore, you subtract 30,000 crores, that is disinvestment this year, then you find that the capital item expenditure is not going up at all. So this is a problem that actually in the net, our capital expenditure from the budget is not going to go up. Secondly, most of the investment that is planned from the budget is going into capital intensive items like big rail projects, road projects, and other such things, and these are all capital intensive. I remember, as a child seeing a road work project where hundreds of people used to be working. Now you barely see 5 people working with big bulldozers, big cranes, and so on and so forth. So in other words, what you're doing is you're not going to be generating much employment out of this directly. And because, as I said, we have cut back expenditure on rural employment guarantee scheme and the other capital labor intensive schemes. So there we are losing employment, and here we'll be generating very little employment. So in the net, it does not look like we are going to generate very much employment in the way the budget is formulated. So the other immediate point is that, the capital intensive projects take time to get off the ground. Whereas the rural employment guarantee scheme, education, health, etc., can be quickly ramped up. So therefore, employment can be quickly generated in those. But in the capital intensive projects, it's the medium and the long term where you may generate some employment, but that too not very much, as I was trying to argue. Okay. Again, there's a problem when you do disinvestment, like happened in Russia, where the kleptocrats, managed to corner a lot of the public sector assets. The danger is that given the crony capitalism that has been afflicting our economy, that might again happen. And therefore, what we may see is that, we may not do as well in terms of disinvestment as probably, the government is expecting. Also, as has been happening, the 1.75 lakh crore target is very large. We may or may not achieve it for a variety of reasons. And one of them is that there'll be a lot of political opposition. Like we are seeing in the case of agriculture, there's a lot of resistance to the kind of changes in the laws. We already see that the trade unions are worried about the privatization of public sector. So you can expect, the workers also to be protesting, and already protest has started in the railways and other public sector units. So it remains to be seen how much of the privatization and how much of the disinvestment is possible given the political environment. And given the pandemic, I think we need to work together rather than have this kind of a problem that is going to crop up politically. Uh, I would have thought that instead of these big projects, it would have been better to go for local infrastructure, education, and health, which would have generated immediate, employment and would have put money into the hands of the poor people. Now, monetization of asset is also being tried, but there's a problem with the monetization of assets. If a lot of assets come to the market in a short time, and we also do disinvestment, and we try to raise 3-4 lakh crores of rupees out of disinvestment and monetization of assets, and when a lot of assets come into the market, then what will happen is the asset prices will tend to fall because people will be liquidating some assets to buy these assets, And in that case, what will happen is that our assets will go rather cheap. And with the cronyism that will be there, the cronies will be able to get the assets cheaper. Now, regarding taxation, the big problem is that the rate of growth of the economy has fallen, and that's why the revenues are very short. Now, GST has been creating a problem because GST is very complex and the unorganized sector is not able to deal with it. So I've been suggesting that we require to basically change GST. The GST collections have risen in spite of hotels, restaurants, tourism, trade, etc., which are big contributors to GST, still being down about 50%. And that shows that something else is happening there. And one of the things that I've heard is that GST figures are gross figures, and government has not been giving back the input credit that it should have been giving back to the businesses. So the gross figures are likely to come down. Second is that the various changes have been introduced in the GST functioning. Maybe because of that, compliance may be a bit better, which is a good thing. But on the aggregate, out of the 1.2, 1.3 crore registered people, only about 85 lakh are filing return under GST. So it just shows that we still need a long way to go. Regarding direct tax aspects, I think it would have been better to actually work on the direct taxes to raise more funds, because indirect taxes tend to be recessionary and tend to be regressive. Direct taxes are a better way to go, and therefore we should have made effort to move towards more direct tax collection and toward the direct tax code, which could simplify the direct tax thing. But I think that may or may not come. We've been talking about direct tax code for several years now, but it has not come, and we need to move towards that. So the issue that will come up will be that how much growth can revive and how much revenue can revive. And if the revenue doesn't revive, as I said earlier, the deficit will turn out to be higher than what is slated. Now, there are other issues that need to be flagged. We are talking about self-reliance, but we are also trying to attract more foreign investment. So I see a contradiction in this, that on the one hand, we are saying one thing, and on the other hand, we are trying to do something opposite. We need to actually step up our own investment. I think our problem has been that our investment had peaked in 2012-13 at about 36.5%, and that came down to 28% before the pandemic. And after that, it has come down even further. So how to raise internal investment, that is, I think, the key to boosting our growth in the economy. And foreign investment is very iffy, because today there's a move towards deglobalization. Mr. Trump had already asked American capital to return to America. Europeans want their capital to return to Europe so that the supply chain can be shortened. So I don't expect much foreign investment to take place because of these things, and also because the Indian economy is still not recovered back to 2019. So unless demand revives, even foreign investment is unlikely, except in a few areas, like we have seen in the telecom sector, a lot of foreign investment coming in spite of the contraction of the economy. But such opportunities are not that large. So I don't expect too much foreign investment to come in. We need to focus on the internal investment process itself. Now, the foreign exchange reserves have risen very sharply, and the government says that that's a good thing. But I think, given the sharp fall in imports, because of which the foreign exchange reserves have taken place, that is a bad indication because the activity level is low, and that's why imports are also lower. So the rise in the the surplus and the foreign exchange account, that is not necessarily a positive thing for the moment. We need to actually step up the economic activity and step up exports, but our exports have been languishing for the last many years, and this fall in imports is not a very good indicator. Similarly, the share market rise is something that needs to be a cause for worry because it's completely out of line with the economy, and the RBI governor in the last 3 months has warned 3 times that it is going to lead to instability in the system. And that's what you find, that the P ratios of some of the key companies have risen sky high. Now, partly it is because they expect that some sectors like IT and FMCG and pharma, they will continue to do well. So one can see that they may do better, but for the market as a whole to go up, that sends signals which can be dangerous. And we saw that in the 2007-8 global crisis, that the market then crashed. And a lot of people lost a lot of money. Now, the political aspects, as Air Marshal had pointed out, in the budget, a lot of expenditure is going to the states which are going to go to polls so as to try and do that. Now, these political aspects are not based on the pure economic thinking. It's based on what is the political interest of the ruling party. And that always creates a problem. So to conclude, one can say that the FM has not taken the correct macroeconomics into account and therefore missed an opportunity to bring the economy faster on its tracks. We needed to hasten our return back to the track. So rather than structural changes which are needed to boost the demand, what is happening is that we are simply doing the long-term and medium-term things. So in the immediate, if the demand is not boosted, then the economic rate of growth will not rise. And higher deficit should have been resorted to both in the current and the next year to boost demand and to boost production. And as I said, we are headed to a new normal and we need to plan for it. So for instance, there are going to be a lot more automation. There's a digital divide, which means that the poor's children will not be able to get education through the net, whereas the well-off sections, their children will be able to get education. There are a lot of other things like work from home, etc., that are on the anvil. So I think, in the new normal, we'll have to worry about employment, about demand, about education, about rising inequality, and we need to plan for that. But I don't see any reflection of that. So there are basic problems that the education sector faces, the unorganized sector faces, which have not been addressed. And rather than go for high cost infrastructure, what was needed that we go for local infrastructure. That also is not there. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Arun Kumar. That's a very comprehensive coverage. Of course, the most important points that you've highlighted are the absence of a macroeconomic overview or focus on the budget, and of course, 2-3 important points stand out, which is not factoring the issues of unorganized sector, which forms a significant part of the economy, and that's been a perpetual problem. And the other things is, of course, the factor of politics in overriding the rationale on which the revenue rising through the disinvestment program needs to be looked at. Divestment actually is a fundamental problem, irrespective of whether this government or the previous governments have done it. They've all followed a standard practice of looking at it as a revenue raising mechanism, rather than addressing the issues of inefficiency and structural problems. That's the main issue. Let me come to Sri Mohan Gurusamy, and I would like to raise your views on the larger questions. One is, of course, historically, investments into infrastructure tends to actually drive the economy through generation of employment, and of course, drive the economy in a much larger perspective. But some important areas, as Professor Arun Kumar also pointed out, is of significant concern, because the figures that's been given out in the budget speech belie the actual figures that some of us have taken out is, for example, investment in the agriculture, allotment, allocation in the agriculture and allied sector is down by 4%. For education is down by 6%. In social welfare, it's down by 10%. Although in defense and urban development, the figures show that it's gone up by 7.4% and 9% respectively. I think that masks a fair amount of already committed, expenditure, as I pointed out, and therefore the figures, the reality may be a little different. Let me hand over to Mohan Gurusamy for your views on this.
Thank you, Marshall. Thank you, Arun, for comprehensive presentation. You pretty much covered everything that has to be said about the budget. But I'll say this about the budget. There are three things I like in it. One is that they've allocated 3,700 crores for a digital census, which is long overdue, because we do census every once in 10 years, and the data is always lagging. So if you get up-to-date data and you can constantly update data, you can do better planning and better targeting. That's a good thing. The second thing I like about the budget is that they have said that people like me will get pre-filled forms. All we have to do is just say, because the government has all the data. They know how much I have in my banks because of Aadhaar and PAN. They know how much income which comes to me. They know how much taxes I've paid because it's all mostly deducted at source. So it tells you pretty much they have all the information. All they're doing is giving us a service of putting it in the form, and you have to say yes or no, this is fine. A good thing, I think. The third thing in the budget, which interested me, was she said no new taxes. Now, seemed to be too good to be true. But when I looked into it, the slabs up to 15 lakhs a year, there are no new taxes. Matter of fact, slight reduction in taxes, a few thousand rupees a year. But the slabs beyond 15 lakhs will have a substantial increase in the incidence of taxes. For instance, a person who earns 2 lakhs rupees a month, and then remind you, every secretary to government now earns more than 2 lakhs a month. And many university professors earn that kind of money. You will all end up paying 2,000, 3,000 rupees more a month in terms of outflow. And so that's an increase. The other increase which comes is the increase in the price of petrol by 2 rupees 50 paise a litre, increase in the price of diesel by 4 rupees a litre. Now, everybody who pays taxes or files a return owns a two-wheeler at least, if not a four-wheeler. Now, that is, there is a certain amount of the family budget which goes for petrol, and that will go up. So that's a form of taxation. Public transport will start costing more, and 76, 78% of our goods are transported by road now, and that cost will go up. Railways use diesel, so those costs will go up. So you will have to pay more. Another increase will be in the form of, in this pandemic, in this pandemonium of the pandemic, we've had complete shutdown of retail markets. Most shops are closed, restaurants are closed. So e-commerce is the way of the future. Everybody does that. But what is happening is it created jobs for delivery people. Now, an Amazon delivery man, and this I know because I talk to them, gets 10 rupees per package, irrespective of distance, irrespective of size, irrespective of volume. So if he's got a friendly dispatcher, he will get a lot of small packets in the neighborhood, and he might make some money out of it. But it's 10 rupees flat rate. Now, that means he has to put petrol, he has to maintain his own two-wheeler, and pay taxes on that, etc. So your home delivery charges are going to go up. You'll see this happening very soon, within next month. It will go up to 12, 14 rupees a package. So to say that there are no new taxes is being very, generous with facts. Now, the other thing is, if you look at all the newspapers, they've all called it a sensational breakthrough budget. And I just looked at yesterday's Hindu. Yesterday's Hindu has a cast of people endorsing the budget, starting with one Mr. Ashok Hinduja of the Hinduja group. Then there's Kumaramangalam Birla, and then a few other people, all tycoons, people who will be. Now, it reminded me of a former president of FICCI, Dr. Charatram, said somewhere in the 80s that we support every budget by any government. He says, otherwise we cannot survive in this country. You can't raise discordant notes because government controls the controlling heights of the economy. Was an industrialist through the industrial licensing policy, but does it through the allocation of funds by the public sector banks, which are 80% of India's banking. So you can't, it's a new form of industrial licensing. Government decides that we've had enough steel mills, we have enough textile mills, so you will not get more money for that. It's for planning through by other means. So I don't think, you will get an honest appraisal of the budget from these people. Even if you kick them hard in the shins and it's hurting a head, they will all smile. They're trained to be like that. So I would not take any of the endorsements in any of the big papers, any of the mainline English newspapers or the big Hindi newspapers seriously at all, because they favor all budgets irrespective of who's in the finance minister and who's in the prime minister. Now, this breakthrough budget, I looked at the total figures. The budget for 2021 was 34.50 lakhs. That's the revised estimates. The budget for proposed budget for 21-22 is 34.83 lakhs. That means this is from the finance minister's budget at a glance. That means, in effect, all you're getting is 33,000 crores increase. 33,000 crores. So where is this breakthrough? Where is this money coming for, which will take us to 11% growth, 7% growth? And how far are we down in the hole? First half of the year, we went down 23%. Second half, they are now saying that has come down to 7.7%. I just you can't trust those figures. If the unorganized sector is not represented in the budget and they're all sitting at home, then how can you have a budget? How can you have an economic forecast? So, Air Marshal asked about the sanctity of these figures. Sanctity of the figures are very doubtful. Now, I always have said, when I was in the government, I said that ideally the government should give a report for the previous year, saying this is what we said we will do and this is what we've achieved. No government has done it, no government will do it. Because what you budget and what you achieve are two different things. Again, we have been promised dreams, a new vision of India, which is great. But the vision is spread over 5-8 years. If you tell Tamil Nadu, you're getting 65,000 crores to build highways. If you only read that much, you'll get very excited. But that is going to be over the next 8-10 years. And that has been announced now because there are elections in 2 months. Now, in 2015, Prime Minister Modi made a package announcement for Bihar just before the elections of 1,20,000 crores, total package. He said, I'm going to transform Bihar. You put me into power. So his friend Nitish Kumar came to power. Nothing happened. Now he's gone back again before this assembly election. And he said, I'll give you 1,20,000 crores again package. Nothing happened. And they are claiming victory in Bihar and saying that, the pandemic performance has not affected us. But look at the details in Bihar. The details are that out of the total vote they had of I'll just get the numbers out, put it out for you. Okay. NDA got 34.86% of the popular vote. 34.86. And Tejasvi Yadav, the 31-year-old boy, he led the UPA, it got 36.20% of the votes. And he lost 10 seats by less than a few hundred margin. And there, the Election Commission is not yet begun to hear them. So does Mr. Modi wear a Teflon coat all the time? Or is the coat now full of holes? And that you can fix the election results by having a chief election commissioner acting arbitrarily. You have to make up your mind on that. Now, the third thing is, like Arun mentioned, and a lot of people, all the newspapers mentioned, is that the health expenditure coming after the pandemic should go up. All the newspapers had sensational headlines. The Economic Times said 82% jump in health outlay. The Hindu said 137% in health and well-being spend. Now, how did they get this number? Because they moved money allocated for drinking water and sanitation department, 60,000 crores, and nutrition, 3,000 crores, into health. It's wonderful. Actual health expenditure has gone up by 9%. Actual health expenditure. The rest is on drinking water and sanitation, which was being spent earlier through another department, independent, separate department. They clubbed it together and said, this is money for health, because water, good clean water is for your health. Good sanitation is for your health. So it is expenditure on health. Now, this includes 35,000 crores earmarked for the COVID vaccine. So what is there for more health facilities and for more health centers, for better health centers? There's very little there, or nothing. It's going to be less than last year. Now, the third thing is, this is particularly dangerous. It's particularly dangerous because first is the budget outlay hasn't gone up by 33,000 crores. Now, this is the capital expenditure. The government has said that they propose to spend 5.54 lakh crores in financial year 21-22. This is 1.14 lakh crores more than the revised estimates. But what did they spend last year, in the year before? The year before they spent 1.30 lakh crores more on capital expenditure. So the rate of increase of capital expenditure actually come down. So there is less money available in a bigger economy for capital expenditure than before. So who are you kidding? You can package it in this way or that way and make it look good. And you say that, we're spending more. But if your overall budget is the same and government employee salaries are not coming down, they've all collected full salaries, full pensions, that is 11.4% of GDP, and interest component of the budget doesn't come down ever, because it has been provided for. And so where is the money coming? What is the capital expenditure money now? And as we've seen, agriculture outlays come down, rural development outlays come down, defense capital expenditure is also pretty flat there. The defense outlay has not gone up by much, given the challenges we face right now. But so they're just kidding themselves. You will come, and the bad news for us, the danger which is lying ahead is that the virus has mutated. And the mutant virus is now rampaging around England. And it has entered France, it has entered Germany, it entered America. And just now I read the newspapers that 8 patients with mutant viruses have arrived in Shamshabad airport in Hyderabad from the direct London to Hyderabad flight. people are in. There are mutant viruses will spread. Now remember, we noticed we got information of the Wuhan virus on January 23rd last year. It took us time to act. We put the lockdown on 21st March, by which time 8 lakh passengers came in to India, and the virus had a new vector to spreading. You had the Tablighi Jamaat, you had the Anandpur Sahib Hola Mohalla, you had all kinds of things, something in Haridwar, even the NRPIO conference took place, so people were coming in. 8 lakh passengers came in that period from overseas. And now we notice that the government has allowed aircraft from abroad to land, as if nothing's happened. Now, if that virus mutates, I hope it doesn't happen. I pray it doesn't happen. What if it mutates and it sweeps? We won't even have the virus for it, and the anti-vax for it. We'll have to start all over again. And the antidote to that will be the mRNA vaccine, which is an expensive vaccine. These are the vaccines made by Pfizer and Moderna. You can reprogram the protein very fast by computer programming and produce it very fast, but it's going to cost you 3,000, 4,000 rupees a shot. A shot. So the full cost will cost you 10,000 rupees. Who in India, apart from the people who pay 30 lakhs, declare incomes of 30 lakhs or 25 lakhs a year, who will be able to afford this? What is going to happen to our economy after that? And this mutant is more serious, more virulent, and is unsparing. It spreads faster. That is the beauty of this mutant, or beauty in a very negative way, that it spreads faster. It's a super spreader by itself. So you're not even talking about it. Your roadmap is fine, but problem with India is that the roads get washed away by floods, some of which we don't know where they're coming from. We don't know when they're going to come. And we saw that last year. And we saw something else the year before last. There were unseasonal floods. Kerala got doused and drenched. Orissa got doused and drenched. So are these people prepared for all this? Or do they just want to get over day by day? We get good headlines, good TV copy, and all the newspaper writers and commentators who are independent, who comment on facts, are quietly being excluded from newspapers and from TV channels. So will these people know the truth? When will they learn the truth? Or do they know the truth and they conceal it? I don't know. So we are looking at a very rough haul now. You're not going to be ready. You're not going to spend more money. And this whole sanctity that you shouldn't spend more money and your debt GDP ratio should be below a certain level. This is created in America by the Washington Consensus. People who want you to take your reserves and put it in American banks where it will get 1% or 0.5% or quite often 0%, so that they can lend it to their own people who will buy goods in China and in India, and we put the money back in American banks. Consequently, today, China has $3 trillion as reserves. We have $580 billion as reserves. There are other countries also. The whole world, 80% of the world's reserves are sitting in American banks. So they want you to hold your money in reserves with them. Which is fair enough. So they say don't borrow too much money. If you borrow too much money, that means that some of that money will have to come back here. Or don't print notes because we are morbidly afraid of inflation. If goods production goes up, services production goes up, and people are paying, urban people should get used to paying more for food, then some inflation is okay. Now you got Bitcoin, everybody is investing in Bitcoin. What is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is not sitting with a pile of gold behind it. It's a notional currency given by some private guy. People are running but our RBI is extremely wary. It is sitting with 16 lakh crores as reserves. Doesn't want to spend that money. He says that's rainy day money. If this is not rainy day, what is it? Why have we got $580 billion sitting in foreign reserves. Kaushik Basu and others have said, who have been in the international financial system, have said that we can easily bring back $150 billion. Now, you can bring $150 billion, make a fund, and invest in India on some infrastructure, some industrial, utilize the money judiciously so that it earns the rate of return. Now, the problem with India is we get money and we can't use it. We're like a family with a certain budget, and the man has got a drinking habit, and the children are growing up, they need milk. So instead of giving them more milk and cutting down the drinking, he continues to drink more and cut the children's milk and stop sending them to school. So in that kind of a dilemma, we make the wrong choices. I'm glad that Sitaraman used the word, if you notice in the budget, of privatization, not disinvestment. Disinvestment is bargain sales of huge assets and so spend it back on revenue expenditure. Privatization implies that you still be the owners, but the managers will be independent. You will not be reporting to a joint secretary who will take care of every investment decision. You want to buy a new machine, you go to him for approval. You want to buy a new car, you go to him for approval. You want to hire people, you go to him for approval. He is, so I call it, actually, I call PSUs the joint secretary sector. So they run this business and they run it badly. And they're always too short, they're very short terms in a job. They're moving around, flitting around from place to place. So there's no continuity in management. So you've got a public sector, which is still the biggest sector in India's industry, which has no management. It is unproductive, and only public sector companies which make money are the ones with administrative pricing. The petrol, little bit of steel, they all make money. Others don't make money. So you've got to get all your companies to earn money. The transformation in China was that the SOE, state-owned enterprises, became independent. Beijing just told the provinces, you take these companies, we transfer ownership to you, and you do what you want to do. The companies were then forced to become profitable, forced to export. And the point of disagreement I have with Arun is on foreign capital coming in. The first drive of China's export took place because of foreign capital. Foreign capital was exporting 70%. Foreign capital establishing production centers in China was exporting 70% of China's exports. You need that kind of export. You need to make trade surpluses every year. You can't live on trade deficits forever and keep devaluing your rupee all the time. The more you devalue your rupee, the more poor you get. And that is a fact we must try to realize. Simple economics say that you can't afford to let your rupee slide forever. You have to earn money abroad. You have to take the other fellow's money and bring it here. It's as simple as that. We don't do that. We're busy giving our money to other people. In the last 10 years, we had a trade deficit with China amounting to $500 billion. We made China, our main adversary today, $500 billion richer. So what kind of national policy is this? And you can't say that, don't come, if you don't buy goods from China, you won't have a laptop, you won't have mobile phones, you won't have all the APIs of pharmaceuticals. It's an interdependent world. You compete with nations by being competitive, not by denial. You can't deny anymore. The world has changed. So, with some of these thoughts, the problem with the government is that I've noticed after having been inside and outside is that it's rocking from event to event. It gets slapped on the face, it starts running in one direction. It gets slapped from another direction, it runs. So there's no plan. There's no long-term vision. You need that, but you can't keep building castles in the air all the time. The speciality of this government is castles in the air. When they came to power, they said 100 new cities. Then they made it 100 smart cities. Now they don't talk about smart cities. Again, Sitaraman has started saying that every state will get one new city. So what is your budget earmarked for that? What is the expenditure earmarked for that next year? How are you going to get the land? Where are you going? Which are the states you have chosen? Pre-election states or states on a rational basis, based on where the population build-ups are taking place. So I think, we need a comprehensive plan, which unfortunately has not been there for almost a decade. And the decade of 2010 to 2020, when historians write recent history in 2030, we say it was the lost decade. We've lost one decade. And to come out of this hole is going to be extremely difficult. And Ms. Sitaraman doesn't show the ability or the inclination or the vision for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohan. That's a very strong statement about the lost decade. Of course, it needs to be taken very seriously and looked at. One of the important observations, Professor Arunpa, you pointed out was, rather than looking at big ticket items and long range items, invest now in local infrastructure, and particularly pointed out about education. And I want to raise a question on that in the context of the new education policy, particularly. It's quite surprising that the allocation for education will come down by 6%. That's one. And there seems to be a fear in lots of minds, professional minds particularly, that the new education policy tends to favor privatization of education. And Indian education system has a major problem. But without state funding, without state support, and without a foundation, thought out foundation being created by the state, no education policy can be successful. And unfortunately, in the country, much of the privatized, education establishments are heavily commercially oriented. What we need is a national orientation towards strengthening the education quality. And therefore, do you think this is a missed opportunity in this particular budget, particularly given the problems that we are going to face as a result of the pandemic, the digital divide between rural and urban areas? That's very clearly evident right now. And that's a huge problem that's manifesting itself in the future.
I entirely agree that they haven't looked at it at all. But, having said that, education is the state subject. The center really looks at higher education. But the problem with our education system is there are two streams of education. One is the state sector, which imparts education in the vernacular. Tamil Nadu, it's Tamil. In Telangana, it's Telugu. So, and all the children of the elite and the middle classes go to the English medium stream. They get a different quality of teachers. The state sector, which is teachers are paid more, but has poor quality of teaching, because they just don't have the infrastructure. I'm connected with two schools in a tribal district in Telangana, and I keep going there every now and then to see what they need and give them whatever they require in terms of what the government is not giving. But mind you, government runs a midday meal scheme in these schools, and there are no thalis for the children. So they rotate, 10 thalis, you eat and then wash it and bring it back. There's cold winter in Hyderabad, where the temperatures go down to about 2 degrees C. They sleep on the hard floor. No blankets, no beddings. These are residential tribal schools. So, what is going to come out of that stream? Pratham report says that children in class 4 and class 5 cannot read and cannot do simple arithmetic. This is nationally in government schools. So in Delhi, you got municipal schools, which this man Kejriwal is now picked up and is bringing them up to shape. And now they began to do well. And you got government schools, where kids come in cars, they all speak in English, and they all do well. They go to Oxford, Cambridge, or whatever. And because they've got a head up. Even tomorrow, if you go to an interview for a job as a clerk in the irrigation department or in a bank, the interview is in English. So what are you going to come from Nagarcoil and from from Nizamabad, what are you going to talk to these guys in? They'll ask you questions in English, and they say, well, you couldn't answer, interview 5 marks. So the system is loaded against you. So how the communists have for a long time had a slogan of Ek Saman Shiksha. There's one education for everybody. Why should we have that? Decide for everything. Now, Mulayam Singh is a big champion of Hindi, but his children went to public school. One went to Mayo College and somewhere else. Now, the leaders don't care, but they talk about nationalism, this kind of ridiculous nationalism of advocating Hindi, a language concocted by the East India Company. Now, we have to come at all these basic things. So what will you do if you, I was just thinking today, I was writing a note on a model school in a rural area. Now, if you say that classrooms will not have more than 40 kids, the teachers will be living in the village, and thus you've got to give them quarters. There are no computers. Now you're talking about Wi-Fi now. None of our rural schools have computers. So what is the Wi-Fi use? So school kids have not had school for a year. Apart from kids in Hyderabad public school and all the good English schools, yeah, where all kids have got laptops and iPads. Hyderabad public school, incidentally, is controlled by the state government, and the Secretary of Education is the president of the trust. So I keep saying, if the Education Secretary spends half that time she spends on Hyderabad public school, on our rural schools, maybe our education will improve. The elite have cornered everything for themselves. The hospitals with MRI equipment, CAT equipment, all that are in the big cities.
Yeah, so the rural focus is extremely...
And now you're saying, I won't give anything, go to insurance company and get yourself insured for health.
Yeah.
Yeah, looking at it from the budgetary point of view, certainly the expenditure compared to the revised estimate has come down. There's no doubt about that. Whereas it needed to go up because, as I said in my presentation, the large number of people have withdrawn their children from the private schools and they would probably have to go to public schools. And also, the midday meal scheme, etc., had been stopped during that period. And that is very essential for the poor children. So all that needed more support. And our target for expenditure, on public education has been 6% of GDP, which is what the Kothari Commission said, and which is what the global average is. But we have never been exceeding 4% of GDP. So we needed to move towards that, and especially given the new normal towards which we are heading, where, as I pointed out, the internet divide means that even the poor children in the urban areas are not able to attend. So I think Wi-Fi has to be made a public good so that it's available freely to everybody. And that needs to be expanded, if our education has to benefit out of that. And then expenditure on the rural schools, etc., has to go up, and also on government schools. And as Mohan says, we need to have a policy where all children have equally good education. Otherwise, their opportunities will not rise, and some will have more opportunity and some will have less opportunity. So for all these reasons, we need to step up our education expenditure quite substantially, which is not what is happening. And that is something that would help us in the future also, because what happened was that because of the pandemic, there was a lot of rumors that were spread, and people are getting their information from the net rather than scientific information. So we need to increase expenditure on science and technology, and also on science education, which is very much lacking. So therefore, I agree with you that we need to step up our expenditure on education, especially for the poor, for the government schools, so that they can come up to a good standard.
Thank you, Arun. And I have two more questions before I open up the questions from the audience. You even in your in your book and the interview, you actually mentioned significantly about not factoring the unorganized sector.
Yes.
Budget never spoke about the unorganized sector as well.
Right.
Could you comment on that and elaborate on that?
So, when we do our calculation of the growth rate of the economy, we are talking about the quarterly growth rate. And in the quarterly growth rate, the data comes only from the organized sector, except for agriculture. So in my book, I have described that how the data from the unorganized sector is proxied by the organized sector. Now, that may be true before a shock, But once a shock to the economy comes, the unorganized sector declines, whereas the organized sector does not decline. So in that case, the split between the organized and the unorganized sector starts rising. So organized sector cannot proxy the unorganized sector. And that's why I've been arguing that since the time of demonetization, then GST, then the NBFC crisis, and now the fourth crisis, the pandemic, the unorganized sector is not represented in our data. It's also not represented in policy. Like for instance, the MSME sector, which is the micro, small and medium sector. Micro units are 6 crore units, small and medium are 6 lakh, but most policies are made for small and medium and not for micro sector. Now in the Atmanirbhar Bharat, we have merged the micro, small and medium by changing the limits. So all policy and the benefit will go to the small and medium and not the micro. We also did not take into account the fact that the unorganized sector in the urban areas live 5 people, 10 people in a room. And if you have lockdown, then how can they be 24 hours locked down in one room, 5 people, 10 people, without clean drinking water, without proper toilet facility, without food? So they'll move around. And that's why initially the case load started rising very dramatically. And by September middle, we were having almost 1 lakh cases a day. We are very lucky that after September it has decreased. But as Mohan said in his presentation, we may have a mutant which is not so virulent as the mutant in Europe and America, but it's always possible that it can mutate. So we have to take the unorganized sector into account in our policy making, in our data. And if we don't do that, then we are barking up the wrong tree.
So in that case, is it right to say that the government has actually, by not factoring the unorganized sector in its strategy, has actually hit itself or shot itself in the foot?
No, so government is always, our policies since independence have been what are called top-down and trickle-down policies. We have always said that advanced sector will rise and then the backward sector will also start rising. And that has not happened to the same extent. The unorganized sector, the poor people, the rural, the farmers, they have not been able to gain the benefit of the development. That's why at a very low level of per capita income, we have a very large number of billionaires. And our billionaires have gained a lot of income during the pandemic also, when large number of unorganized sector were suffering. So it is this divide that has taken place, which is what has been the policy right since the independence time. It's time to change that, and what Gandhi suggested, development from below. That is the right policy that we should have followed, where we should have tried to give more incomes at the bottom, tried to give education, tried to give health. And when these things happen, then our labor force become more productive, our growth rate increases, and that's the way we need to develop. And as I said, we are headed towards a new normal. In this new normal, giving a living wage to the poor people is very essential. Otherwise, they're not able to take care of the pandemic. That's why you saw millions and millions of people migrating from urban to rural areas, because they did not have money to even buy 1 week of supplies. So as soon as their income stopped, now in the next pandemic, if you look at it in the last 20 years, this is the 7th virus that has come. We had Zika and Nipah and SARS and MERS. And then, Ebola, and Ebola was deadly because 50% of those who got the disease died, Now, if the next virus is as virulent as this one and as deadly as the Ebola, we'll be in deep trouble. So we need to have a population which is able to take care of itself. And that's why we need to change our thinking about our development paradigm.
Absolutely, absolutely. Mohan, you actually alluded to the public sector and disinvestment issue. Again, and we've actually spoken about this many times over. The issue of privatizing is absolutely vital, as you said, but in the context of the Atmanirbhar that we've been actually speaking about over the last couple of years, the self-reliance and control over reducing particularly the defense imports and control over critical technology is an issue that's only been spoken about, but in terms of practice, in terms of laying out a substantial strategy, there seems to be a shortfall in that. So will Atmanirbhar be also in the same way? Because you can sell out the shares and you can privatize to some extent, but you also the government needs to be involved in terms of whom to get in as the private investor with a risk-sharing capability and risk-sharing accountability to be able to take forward the PSU that's been privatized in the correct roadmap that the government wants it.
No, Arun said something very interesting that bears some understanding. If you sell your assets and you spend it on revenue expenditure, then you're not achieving anything. If you sell your assets to somebody else coming from abroad or from another sector, he would have used that money to set up another industry or something else. You forgone that opportunity. Where capital is limited. You've given him something ready-made and you've taken the money and gone and smoked it away. Now, you're not achieving anything. All you're doing is meeting some budgetary figure for this year to please some fellow in Washington who has given you the Washington consensus on what your deficit should be. Now, do you know what the foreign reserves of the United States is? Only $68 billion. But they define that we should have reserves to cover 6 months of imports. That is your definition of how much reserves you're going to have. So I think we've got to look at all these things again and take a holistic view of it. You just can't do a little bit here, a little bit there. You need to have a government, a system which can bring everybody together, all heads together, and brainstorm and talk things over, come up with new ideas. What we've got is a breakdown of political discourse, a breakdown of any discourse. We're all fighting with each other all the time. And this is not atmosphere conducive for economic growth or political development or social development. We want to get more conciliation in our country, which is very difficult to achieve. Right now, we're looking for scapegoats. You know, I told you I was in Bidar this afternoon. And you know, half the guys who come there say, look, these guys had a good time here. So we must square it off with them now. Half marvel at the beauty and the power of that fort and say this was us. And this is how we've divided the country. When Bidar becomes identified with somebody and Meenakshi temple gets identified with a certain section, then we're in trouble. The greatness of Jawaharlal's conception was he made all this ours. Taj Mahal was ours, Meenakshi temple was ours, everything was ours. When you say that it's them and us, you're in trouble. And that's what's happening to us last 10 years.
Very quickly, I would say that we need to step up expenditure on R&D. Our bugbear has been very poor R&D, whether in civilian or in defense areas. And for that, we need to step up education budget, you know. Again, why we did not join RCEP? Because, you know, not joining RCEP is a problem and joining RCEP is a problem. Either way, we are in trouble because RCEP is going to be, you know, China-centric and would also, you know, mean that probably our deficits in the external sector will go up. Now, regarding foreign capital, what I was saying is that we are unlikely to get a lot of foreign capital. So we have to make our internal effort, you know. And the reason why foreign capital is not going to come in big ways, that if the economy is not doing very well, if people are deglobalizing, then the foreign capital go back to their own countries rather than come to India, you know. So I think we have to make an internal effort on getting capital to come in, getting investment to come in, you know, into the economy. And for that, the public sector has to take the lead because the private sector will not invest unless the public sector starts investing more. So I think this chain has to be there.
The facts of life are that 68% of foreign investment in India is Indian. It is money round tripping. We don't find our economy interesting enough, hopeful enough to keep our money here, so we take it abroad. And then we bring it back. So foreign investment is ours. So India must become attractive to Indians to invest. And a lot of this money is sitting out. Indians are the biggest investors in the in London Stock Exchange, in new companies, Greenfield Expert. Even in America, they're big investors. The notion that Indians have no money to invest is wrong. Indians have lots of money sitting in Singapore, elsewhere, invested elsewhere. Look at where our foreign investment is coming from. Most of it comes from Mauritius or Singapore. And that's Indian money. It's not as if Ford Motor Company is coming to invest. If that were so, it was different. If they're coming to establish production units to take cars from India to sell it in South Africa or in Venezuela or in Kenya, is a different matter. It's not happening because we are not producing, because it's not attractive for us also. We have too much of interference, ease of doing businesses. We've slipped down in the last 5 years. Why would anybody want to invest in India if you're 140 in ease of doing business? It's very difficult to set up a factory here. I've run a large company, I know what the problems are.
Mm.
And labor is incredibly hard to deal with because the unions fight, political parties fight for control of unions. Unions means income for them.
So those need obviously policy changes with respect to labor laws and
Are all required.
yes, they're all required. Absolutely. Let me get on to some of the questions. I think this question probably would be to Professor Arun. This is from Mr. Mohan in MMA. What is the revenue and fiscal deficit in absolute numbers for fiscal year 21-22? Not sure whether I saw it in the finance bill. Expenses are 34.6 lakh crores. Revenue numbers are not clear.
No, in the budget at a glance, you'll get these figures, and you'll get these figures also in the receipts budget and so on. But let me read it. The revenue deficit slated for the coming year is 11,40,576 crores, and the fiscal deficit is slated at 15,06,812 crores. So you can always get it in the budget at a glance. Budget at a glance will give you a nutshell, the overall revenue, the overall expenditure, and the overall deficit. And there are 4 deficits that are given: the revenue deficit, the effective revenue deficit, the fiscal deficit, and the primary deficit. These are all given. So just Google for the budget at a glance, and you'll get all these figures for the actual of the preceding year, the revised estimate of current year, budget estimate of current year, and the budget estimate of next year. So they'll all be available.
Okay, this is another question from Mr. Sundar. This is also from MMA, and either of you can answer that. Do you think increasing the FDI limit from 49 to 74% in the insurance sector is a good idea? If yes, why do you think so?
Mohan?
I think, I'm personally not averse to foreign investment because dividend outflow in a stream is the smallest stream out of a company. It's always small. Because, if foreign companies invest, they'll bring some of their funds also here. They manage huge funds also. That money could be available for investment in India. Because our returns even on bank deposits are high. If you bring money from the US and put it in Indian banks, you still get 6% or 5%, whereas you'll get 0 in America. So I think I'm not allergic at all, but there are tricky fellows. Some big investment, some insurance scam they'll pull off and run. So who comes in is also very important.
I'll give a very short response to this, which is that insurance is about risk taking. It's about life risk, that the individual takes, and therefore there has to be a certain degree of certainty about that risk. Now, if a private sector begins to control it, to a greater and greater extent, then I think there's a lot of chance of problems arising, and that's what you see even in the USA. There, it's completely in the private sector. The issue is that what is the role of LIC in the Indian economy? LIC has played a big role of supporting the government and its various policies. Now, if that gets diluted, then government's own actions within the economy will become diluted. For instance, whenever the stock market starts tanking, LIC and other such agencies, they are asked to buy the shares so as to support the market. Now, these kind of things will therefore become much less, and therefore there's a likelihood of greater risk in the economy and greater risk to the funds that are deposited by people for the long run.
Arun, if I may say so, that is a little perverse argument that we need LIC in the government sector so that the government can misuse that money in the stock market.
Well, I'm not saying
the stock market.
So it's right that you can always misuse things, but you can also use it positively. So what I'm saying is there's a positive aspect to the LIC, which is available to the economy. Now, I mean, like anything you can misuse, like for instance, crony capitalism has been widespread in the Indian banking system and so on.
Crony capitalism is joint security capitalism.
Yeah. So,
They are all giving directives to LIC. How to make
that's why I said accountability is needed.
You need to depower the government.
No, but you have to have accountability. I mean, there's no situation where there'll be no government. Government will always be there, but accountability is needed.
There are large private companies. Tata Steel is there. Is it not accountable to shareholders? Is it not accountable to its managers?
Well, I mean, one can discuss that in.
Accountable is not right.
No, one can discuss that in greater detail. After all, there's a lot of black income generation, a lot of illegality done by large companies also. So you require accountability to the shareholders also. So in my book, I've discussed why you require accountability to the public, whether of business, whether of politicians, whether of the bureaucracy. So accountability is an issue in India. There's no doubt because we have such a large black economy.
I have a different view on black money. Big public corporations don't generate so much of black money. It's the intermediates, people who deal with land, who supply small things, who deal with, that means they're not declaring taxes. What is black money? Money on which you don't declare taxes. It's not some money printed in the ISI press in Karachi. So it's big companies.
Unaccountable money.
Take money out.
No, it's not unaccountable money, but unaccountable income. The income. See, money is an asset, income is a flow. So we are talking about income that is not declared. And there, I would say even big corporations do that very systematically because there's under-invoicing, over-invoicing, there's, flight of capital. And I know most of our big companies have thousands of companies through which, you do, what is called layering, the process of layering and through which you take money out. So it's not just small companies and medium companies, even big companies do that. But anyway, let's not get into that. I mean, in the context of the budget, it's a long discussion.
Let me come on to the other question, which is important in the context of particularly, Atmanirbhar and defense. Mr. Vaidyanathan is asking a question, how is the foreign investment, how will it stifle self-reliance? FDI will bring new technology and know-how and boost demand, in turn will lead to self-reliance. Arun, your comments.
Yeah, so, my argument has been that, you will get some foreign investment always. You can attract more foreign investment, but 95% of the investment is Indian investment. Only 5% is coming from outside. And the fact that our investment rate in the economy has dropped from 2012-13, where it was 36.5%, to even before the pandemic to 28%, and now down to even probably around 20%, So there's a big drop in investment, of roughly about, some like 16%. Now, even if foreign investment comes in more, okay, and brings in technology, the basic investment that should be there is the Indian investment that has to go up. Secondly, the foreign investment that comes will be capital intensive most of the time. Only in some areas will it be labor intensive, whereas we need to generate employment. The net employment generation that has to go up. If more of Amazon and more of such companies come, then the retail trade gets affected, as is happening. Then the retail trade, which generates a lot of employment, that employment will be killed. So in the net, the employment generation will be less. And that's where I think the problem lies, that foreign investment in key technologies is essential. Where we don't have technology, that is essential. But in areas other than that, foreign investment coming in is going to stifle employment generation in the country. So we have to be careful what kind of investment coming in. But now with the globalizing world, you can't make those prescriptions that you can only allow this investment, but not that investment. So in the Atmanirbhar Bharat, they're going in for more protectionism. They are now raising customs duty for the last 3 budgets. This is the 4th budget in which customs duties have been raised in an attempt to produce more in the country. Now, so all this has to be balanced out. And I think technology is the key. If we had developed technology, we could have opened up, without a problem, And because we have not developed good enough technology to compete with China and other countries, I think we are in trouble, whether it's vis-a-vis RCEP, whether it's vis-a-vis the US and so on, whether it's vis-a-vis defense. Most of the things that we should be producing ourselves, we are actually importing, in a big way. So, we need technology. I think that's where the focus, a 10-year plan is needed to ramp up our technology, which means a lot of investment in R&D and in higher education.
Absolutely. And there the technology actually needs to factor multiple strategies. One is You need, foreign technology companies to join up hands with local industries to create the partnerships, which over time creates a technology diffusion through which you absorb technologies that you don't have. And the second one, of course, parallelly, you invest in R&D, in education, and a whole lot of other. This is exactly what China did to leapfrog itself. And unfortunately, there is a discontinuity in that strategy in our, in our thought process. This is a separate, very big subject by itself, and I think, but the budget needs to probably intervene in this entire process to be able to have that continuity on technology investments in the country and provide that 10-year, 20-year time frame continuity, as you pointed out. So I think we are coming to the end of the event today, running out of time. But one question I can request Professor Arun to address: the government is given out a projection that the collection, personal income tax and corporate income tax, is projected to grow by more than 22% in the fiscal year 21-22, and this is largely due to base effects. Is that very optimistic? Is it true?
Yes, I think that's very optimistic, because at a very, as Mohan himself said, by the time we vaccinate 60%, by the time we have herd immunity, it'll be another 8-10 months. So we're not going to go back to the 2019 level of GDP for at least 8 to 10 months. So in the coming year also, the rate of growth will be negative, as compared to 2019. It'll be positive as compared to 2020, because the 2020 base effect, as you rightly put it, will be there. So our tax collection will still be below the 2019 level, as far as I can see. It will not exceed the 2019 level of tax collection. So the government is being very optimistic, both for current year and for next year. And that's why I expect that the deficit will rise. And when the deficit rises, they'll cut back on capital expenditures and on social sector expenditures, which will slow down growth.
Okay. So let me just request your concluding remarks with a final question from my side. And of course, Mohan has been very ardent advocate of, we have 560 billion. In a crisis situation like this, why can't we actually dig into our reserves, and with very well-crafted strategies, why can't we actually bridge the gaps that exist and reboot the economy into a growth model? As I said, if I link it to the BRICS report that originally came out, they projected that even if India grows at an average of 4 to 5% over the next 50 years, which is what is expected to do, it'll be on a very strong trajectory upwards to overtake, the other two major leaders who are in the economy. Let me invite your comments, concluding remarks on this issue.
Yeah, I think we have to recover the lost momentum. That's going to take some time to come. And the basic economics will tell you that you have to spend money on capital expenditure. And government should cost less. Now, we had the pandemic last year. They were squeezing other sectors, but the government sector was not squeezed at all. Everybody got their leave travel, everybody got their salaries, full payments, but you could have taken away 10% from them. And so they said, lean times, the country is starving, people are starving, so you have to tighten your belt. We didn't do that. So if you get your reserves from abroad and give it to these guys, it's not the correct way to do it. That money should be earmarked only for capital expenditure, for new investment and profitable investment, not for crony investment. Not to allow some fellow to retire as NPS. Now, so therefore, that money, if you establish a fund of $100 billion, it should be run like a private fund with professional managers. It can't be run where you shuffle the trustees every 3 months. This joint secretary, that joint secretary coming and going. Then the kitty will be looted. The problem is that, the finance minister has said something about DFI. She hasn't outlined it. She's picked up some of these ideas which you've been floating around. But typically what will happen is they'll make a mess of it. Now, I'll give you a classic example. We said gold bonds. We have lots of subterranean gold in this country. It's been coming over the years, over the generations and decades. So you get some of that gold out, make that gold work a bit. So you offer them bonds and give them a small coupon rate of 1 or 2% and say, you bring in 100 grams, we'll give you the equivalent as a bond today. And when you want to redeem it at that market price, we'll redeem it. In the meantime, we'll give you a coupon rate. What happened by the time they put it to the system, they started asking, where did you get this gold from? Who earned it? Since when did you get it? So instead of creating a bond which could be fungible, you made people more afraid, saying that these guys want to know. Now, if I got jewelry which came from my great-great-grandmother, what am I going to say now? So I say, take it and give me a bond for it. It's not working at all. Many people have bullion bars sitting, inherited, not working at all. So, you got to do this with your imagination. I'm not in favor of moral rearmament at this stage. Like Deng said, doesn't matter the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mice. We're not catching mice at all. And we got fat cats instead of black cats and white cats. So I think, we've got to temper moral expectations with realism also. So, otherwise they say that, oh no, but you're legitimizing people who invested in gold. I think anyway the gold is there. Make it work. You can increase your ability to spend by $100, $120 million. We made a mess of it. Today nobody buying a gold bond.
But Mohan, there's a macro implication of using the foreign exchange reserves to do investment in the country, because you'll be importing, because that's foreign exchange. So you have to increase your imports and then you have to invest. Now, if the demand is short, then that may not happen. I think, again, it comes down to the question of demand, raise demand, and when you need to invest, use the foreign exchange to do the importation that may be required. So I think there are macro implications that need to be taken into account.
The macro implications are if you use it as an investment fund.
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
Not to give for spending.
Yeah, so that's why I said capital investment and import the capital equipment, but that may have implications.
You import capital.
Well, you will be importing, because you'll be using foreign, you'll be importing things now. So therefore, that might set back your capital goods industry. So macro implications would have to be taken into account.
But foreign capital equipment is a very small component of an industry. If you buy a centrally, numerically controlled machining center, that might cost 1 crore, but you will need paraphernalia, you will need tools, you will need.
No, Mohan, I'm making a different point.
$10 million, 10 crores rupees.
No, Mohan, I'm making a different point. When you use foreign exchange reserves to actually, do the investment, you're right that there'll be local investment also along with it. But the point is, when you use foreign exchange reserves, what will you be doing? You'll be importing things, because after all, using foreign exchange reserve, not in India, you'll be using it, to get things from outside. So there'll be balance of payment, there'll be macros. I'm saying it's a larger question.
You convert it.
No, so it's a larger question. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a larger question.
Okay. Yes, that probably then becomes a major policy issues and major, challenge for the government to actually look at it. Anyway, so we've come to the end of the session today. Let me thank Professor Arun Kumar and Sri Mohan Guruswamy. It's been a great pleasure to, interact with you both this evening. And it's been a wonderful session. And I'm sure the audience would have enjoyed it tremendously. We had at one point of time nearly 111 people who had actually logged in. And this is an exceptional evening. Thank you so much for being with us on behalf of the Peninsula Foundation and an MMA. I thank you for being with me this evening on this interactive session. Let me hand over to Vijay for the vote of thanks and the conclusion of the evening.
Thank you, Marshall. Thanks. As you said, it's a fascinating evening. So thanks so much for the great insight. The number of questions have come. Sorry, we couldn't answer the question on the philosophy of the government. Most of the questions have been discussed in public domain and newspapers. So that's why we thought we'll only take the insights from two great economists, what is happening. Thanks so much. And on behalf of Peninsula Foundation and MMA, we would like to show our appreciation to both the speakers who joined us in spite of healthy, and good night. Thanks, Mr. Mohan and Arun. It's always a pleasure to get connected.
Thank you very much.
We'll keep getting you over again. Thanks, Air Marshal, as usual, for a brilliant moderation, bring the best out of both the panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to Air Marshal and to Mr. Vijay Kumar.